Hi there, my name is Richard Ray with Workforce Systems Design. Here to talk with you about the workforce development functions and questions that should guide leaders and how they explore talent strategies. Often people will ask us, well, what are the workforce development functions and what should we be focusing on? HR professionals, organization development professionals often are exposed to situations where they're using the different functions to help guide their organization and understanding talent and human capital. But for the first line leaders, these functions can sometimes be a little bit of an enigma. So back in 1999, working with a group of people at NASA and the US Treasury, we identified common workforce development functions that organizations should explore in order to create a full pipeline, that is a full talent pipeline. So no matter what industry you're in, whether it's healthcare or construction, whether it's a marketing firm, whether it's a banking system, the first part of workforce development is understanding what social capital exists in the world for your organization. Simply, you're trying to answer the question, what is the available workforce in society? Now, this doesn't mean that that workforce is already prepared and ready to onboard. What this could mean is it could be that you are looking at a variety of recruitment strategies, not just for today, but 10 years from today. So for instance, if you're in the construction industry, what social capital exists? Often it's the social capital that you create either by partnering with local high schools or universities or technical colleges and working with those instructors to identify what the future talent looks like. In healthcare, we're seeing more and more hospital systems and healthcare providers understand that you can't focus on hiring that oncologist today or that primary care physician or even that nurse today. You've got to be thoughtful in helping to develop what that future workforce looks like. So that could mean that as a healthcare system, you're using interns, you're providing opportunity for residents to practice in your system. It could even be as simple as having job talks at local high schools in order to encourage young people to get interested in healthcare careers. So social capital is not just focused on what workforce exists today or what employees exist today, but it's understanding your role as an employer and helping to identify the future workforce. The next function is what we call organization attractiveness. Some people will often speak about this in terms of employment brand, or they'll often even talk about it in terms of recruiting brand. But it's simply, are people attracted to your organization? So how do I attract people to my workforce, to my organization? One of the greatest examples of this is Aflac Insurance. In the late 1990s, they began to link their brand of their insurance products to their employment brand. They did this with the Aflac Duck, but they also did it by partnering with universities like the University of Georgia, for instance, to make Aflac a positive brand, a brand that not only did people want to work with, but a brand that they were attracted to both as consumer and employee. So we've identified social capital and organization attractiveness as things that occur or functions that we have to focus on before we actively begin recruiting. Now we actually get to the recruiting stage. This is how you bring talent into your organization. So essentially, as a leader, whether you're a first-line leader or whether you're the executive in the firm, you're not expecting HR, the human resources staff, and the recruiters to be attracting the talent and bringing them on board. You're now taking an active role in asking the question, how do I convince people to join my organization? At this point, you begin to have formal recruiters involved, but you've already established that people want to be with you and they want to be in your organization and they want to be a part of your brand. So at this point, you're just trying to put in the apparatus that we typically think about when we think about recruiting. This could include social media. It could include traditional approaches. It could include things like job fairs at universities. It could even include being involved in internships and co-ops as a way to attract employees to your organization. So to this point, we've been talking about how we send messages to people, the potential employees. Now we move into selection. This gets a little bit more complicated because now you're trying to identify not only how do I attract people from the labor pool that exists, and how do I begin the active process of recruiting. Now I may be using things like assessments, I may be using interviews, I may be using a variety of tools to identify how I reach into that vast pool of employees and bring in people that are fit to my organization. This process is managed by HR, but it's best driven by the hiring managers themselves. Once you've selected the employee and once they've made a decision to join you, now begins the process of socialization and orientation into your organization. So as a manager, now you're trying to identify, how do I introduce people to my workplace? How do I encourage these people not to just be passive bystanders in the organization, but how do I convince them to apply their human capital, their intellectual capital, their talents to the organization that I've just spent so much time recruiting? Organizations are getting smarter about this. Instead of the old 2-day orientation program, some people are being creative by creating movies about their organization and how people fit into them and how they contribute. People are also, the more sophisticated organizations are thinking about a more involved and engaged orientation process. For instance, a lot of healthcare companies have moved into what we call nurse resident programs. In the past, you would typically hire a nurse and hope that he or she would stay with you, and periodically you would check in and make sure that they were still engaged, hoping to encourage them to stay in your organization and treat your patients. But we also know that there's a significant number of employees that join us and then they depart. Actually, there's some very interesting work at the ROI Institute out of Birmingham, Alabama, with Jack Phillips, that is looking at the cost of a bad hire. So at this point, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that all those people that we have sought after, all those people that we've encouraged to apply, all those people that we've made an offer and then accepted, we want to encourage those people to stay. So orientation is a very different activity than it was even a few years ago. At this point, you're trying to convince them to contribute their talents every single day. And in the past, orientation was a human resources department activity. Today, it's a full-blown leadership activity. And I would say that when an employee is onboarded, the socialization process begins. We can use any type of assessments to do that, to make sure that they socialize. But when it's all said and done, it is up to that leader to make sure that they fit into the organization. Training is the sixth major workforce development function. Essentially, at this point, you've brought people on board, and this happens simultaneously with socialization and orientation. Essentially, you're trying to determine what courses, what activities, what mentoring, what training, and you can think about it almost in terms of classroom or online training, formal training, does this employee need to be successful? For instance, a construction employee, you hire an electrician, they have some basic electrical skills, but now there's training that needs to occur to make them operate at the best of their ability. This could also not just include technical training, but it could include things like quote-unquote soft skills training. So how do you form into a team? How do you contribute? How do you improve performance? Training can be from the very most basic conversations to the most sophisticated courses. It could even be enrolling your employees into a formalized degree or certificate program if that enhances their ability to perform their functions. Often you'll hear training combined with development and almost used as the same thing. Training is very different from development. Training is immediate instruction, immediate training, immediate development that allows a person to do their job. Development is a little bit of a more more of a long-term enterprise. And essentially at this point, you're not worried about teaching a specific skill or activity. You're trying to identify competencies that these employees need over time so that they stay engaged and they achieve the organization's success. Often, a development plan is created for an employee that helps them align to what the strategy for the department and for the organization is. Development may be continued education, it may be formal education, it may be mentoring, it could be job shadowing with other departments. One of my favorite development activities is when you take, for instance, in healthcare, you take a physician who's been practicing in clinic for 5 to 6 years, and you partner them with an administrator, or you partner them with a senior nurse, and have that nurse or that senior administrator work on competencies such as financial management or customer service. And so you take the person typically out of their comfort zone in development, and you help them identify new competencies that will help them be more successful in the organization. So we've recruited these people. We've helped to create a pool of employees to recruit from. We've selected them. We've oriented them into our organization. We've trained them. We developed them. And now it's time to give them feedback on how well they're performing. Regardless of the level in an organization, every employee, including the CEO, should be getting performance feedback. And so we measure performance in a lot of different ways. We can do it through surveys. We can do it through conversations. We can have 360 or multi-rater evaluations of employees. Essentially, what we're trying to do is we're trying to give the person we're evaluating a good, honest, objective view of how their performance is impacting the organization. And if there's gaps, it's our job to then roll that back into the training and development system in the organization to make sure that people continuously improve. Evaluation will sometimes take the form of performance appraisals. And when we talk about performance appraisals at Workforce Systems, we're not talking about lining people upside the supervisor's office once a year and having them roll in and read a few notes off of a performance development form. We're actually talking about an ongoing conversation. So we typically recommend that you do formal performance feedback and review once a year, but you make time and actually schedule that time in your calendar once a month to give an employee feedback on how they're doing, both formative feedback as well as developmental and corrective feedback. So good workforce development plan or good workforce strategy not only is about bringing people on and aligning those people to the strategy of the organization. It's not just about developing them and training them and giving them feedback. It really is about how do you retain that top talent and how do you manage the outplacement of staff. And really more than just the outplacement of staff, but when knowledge leaves or when someone retires or someone's replaced or someone leaves due to performance, there is a body of knowledge that they have that you have to be able to capture so that you have consistency and stability in your workforce development process. So retention and outplacement is the ninth function that we often talk with our clients about. And this is essentially how employees leave the organization. A great friend years ago, Dave Bransky, shared with me that you can tell an awful lot about an organization in the way that they manage people leaving that organization, whether it's voluntary or involuntary. So, of course, this is done with respect, but it's also done with an eye on the future, so that as that person leaves, if they need to continue to be a resource, we create a system that allows them to do that, even if it's an involuntary separation. We also want to make sure that when people leave the organization, that we manage the competencies that they have. If you have the person who was responsible for strategic planning for organization, if you have them leave and you don't have a succession plan in place, or if you don't have what some people call backfill, where someone can fill in that position until you make a permanent replacement, you're putting your organization at risk. And it's not just around strategic planning. It could be around any given activity. Again, if you look at construction companies, if you know that you've got projects that are concluding and you have a body of employees, let's say a couple hundred electricians who will be ready to get onto another project, you have to manage what happens there. If not, you'll lose those employees, or they'll decide that they'll lose themselves. They'll look for new opportunities, and you lose all that talent that you've developed over time. So this is a simple model of workforce development. We've used it now for over 20 years. We've had several articles written on it, a couple of book chapters, and every day it seems we use one element or another to help executives understand how to manage their existing workforce, how to attract the new workforce, and how to engage their workforce.